Hello, today I will be talking about how my grandmother immigrated from the former Soviet Union to America. Growing up, I always knew my family was a little different than the people around us. My grandparents had accents, spoke in different languages, and weren't accustomed to the American cultural norms. When I got older, I was able to understand why my grandparents and parents had immigrated from the former Soviet Union, specifically Latvia and Belarus, when my parents were very young. This story is about my grandma and mom's experience, though. My grandma has always been an amazing storyteller, so I knew I wanted to interview her to hear her story about immigrating to America. My whole family is Jewish, and in Belarus, you couldn't be Jewish. This was the main reason they decided to immigrate from Belarus to the United States. It was a very hard decision for my grandmother to make, but in the end, she felt it was the right decision. My grandmother said, growing up in the Soviet Union, we were groomed and brainwashed. Her parents were always on edge whenever they were talking badly about their country, and they felt like someone was always listening. It wasn't until after high school that she realized how bad the anti-Semitism was. This one was in 1961. When you graduate from high school, the next thing you go to is like a college, but there are different institutes. This is where you could become a doctor, lawyer, engineer, or other professions. Because my grandma was Jewish, she said her only option was the Polytechnical Institute. She had no choice but to go there. She talked about how you would only be able to get into higher institutions if you knew someone who could get you in. The hate the Jewish people felt in the Soviet Union was crazy. Even if you had straight A's in school, you would have to take a verbal exam, and during the verbal exam, they would be able to tell if you were Jewish, and they could automatically fail you. My grandmother's family was not rich enough for her to just go to school, so she had to work while she was in school. It was very hard for her to find a job because no one would hire a Jewish person. She said that finding work was tough, and if you were Jewish, your only option for work was the lower level jobs. I asked her when I was interviewing her how they could tell if you were Jewish, and she said they'd look in your passport and see that you were Jewish. The USSR had internal passports with your name, date of birth, and nationality. If you were Jewish but lived in Belarus, it didn't say Belarusian, it said Jewish. This was unimaginable to me because being born in America, my passport says American. But even though my grandmother was born in Belarus, her passport said Jewish because to the USSR, it was a completely different thing to be Jewish. My grandmother was luckily able to find work at a company that had moved down from Siberia because they had not become anti-Semitic yet. She was able to work for this company until they left Belarus, which was for 8 years. This life was horrible for them, but if they tried speaking up for what was right, or even speaking out against their own country, they would have been sent to jail or gotten kicked out of the country. People would do all kinds of horrible things to the Jewish people living in Belarus. I asked my grandmother how they could tell if she was Jewish, and she said they just could. Everyone here was raised so anti-Semitic that they could always tell. One time, I was waiting for the bus to come, and a drunk man walked up to me and yelled at me to get the hell back to Israel. This was very interesting to me because I can't always tell if someone is Jewish or not Jewish, but I guess being raised to hate Jewish people can make them easy to spot. My grandmother wasn't allowed to celebrate Jewish holidays because it was punishable by law. Everyone in the city had to celebrate the same holidays and do the same things, and no one was allowed to be different. My grandmother said, my father always tried to break the norms and do little things to celebrate, but it couldn't just be done by one person. It would have no impact. He would read books to me in Yiddish and try to keep Judaism alive, but the society wasn't doing it as a whole because they were too scared. The last year my grandmother lived in the USSR, she lived with her parents, husband, daughter, her sister, brother-in-law, and nephew. The 8 of them lived in an apartment with 1 bathroom and a very small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a living room that was half a bedroom, half a living room. My mom was born in 1975, and in the early 70s, people started a movement towards letting people leave the Soviet Union. A lot of Jewish people worked with my grandmother, so many of them started to leave. My grandmother said the biggest immigration from the Soviet Union was in 1978 and 1979. My grandfather was ready and wanted to leave the Soviet Union, but my grandmother didn't. Even after everything she went through living there, she wasn't ready to leave because she didn't want to leave her family behind. They wouldn't come with them to America. The final push for my grandmother to leave was when my grandfather asked her, "Do you want our daughter to grow up to be ashamed of who she is?" My grandmother knew she didn't, and during this time, she did a lot of soul searching. They got approved for a visa right before the 1980 Olympics that were being hosted in Moscow. My grandmother said the Soviet Union wanted to get rid of Jews before the Olympics, so it made it easier for us to leave. They were allowed to bring 2 suitcases, any money they had, and some packages that would be shipped over to America. My grandmother, grandfather, mom, great-grandmother, and great-grandfather left the Soviet Union on April 26, 1980, and a month later, the door closed for anyone to be able to leave the Soviet Union, so they got out just in time. Once they left, they had to get to Vienna, Austria, to be sponsored by the Jewish organization and apply for asylum. They then went to Rome once they were sponsored because it was the next stop. They were given an allowance and had to find an apartment while the organization figured out which Jewish federation would accept them in the U.S. My grandmother described Italy as going from living under an iron curtain to living freely. There were positives and negatives of Italy. The positives were they lived by the beach and had a bar that played music all the time. They also had a library where they were able to check out any book they wanted. This really stood out to my grandmother because it was the first time she felt free. The negatives were they lived in a very blue-collar, dirty, crime-ridden area in Italy. My grandma described the time they lived in as interesting but very uncertain times. They finally got assigned to Columbia, South Carolina, and arrived in America 2 months after they left the Soviet Union on June 28, 1980. Exactly 2 months later, my grandfather got a job, and then, 2 months after that, my grandmother did too. They both had to study English since it was their second language. My grandmother said the TV and radio were always on so they could always be learning. I bet my grandmother was exaggerating a little bit, but she said, after 2 weeks of kindergarten, Ina was already speaking English. Ina, my mom, was 4 years old during the immigration process. My grandma explained to me that it was really hard for my mom. She couldn't have what other kids had because she was an immigrant and they were very poor. I asked my grandma what the biggest culture shocks for her were and when she came to America, and she said, we were introduced to Jewish life here. Being able to go to synagogue and celebrate Jewish holidays was all very new. My grandmother had never fasted for the holiday Yom Kippur, but when they got to the U.S., she started fasting because of her father and because she had the freedom to do whatever she wanted. For their first American holidays, Halloween and Thanksgiving, a family invited them over to introduce them to the American culture. The first holiday season they spent in Columbia, my grandma said, I had never felt so lonely in my life. There were beautiful lights everywhere and everyone was getting ready for Christmas, but all I could think about was how much I missed my mom, dad, and sister. She was so close with her family and it was so hard being away from them. She didn't know the next time she would see them. During the time they immigrated to the U.S., the Cold War was at its peak. My grandma would send a letter to her parents but knew someone would be reading it, so she could never feel genuine or safe about what she was writing. She wouldn't get in trouble, but her family could, which was what worried her most. She told me, you could order a phone call, but it would have to be 2 weeks in advance, which was a big hurdle, and someone would always be listening. This was crazy to me because, at the time my grandmother left the Soviet Union, she wouldn't know it, but it was the last time she would ever see her father. My mom told me my grandmother was closest with her father, and after hearing my grandmother explain her story to me, I can now understand why she does some of the little things, like fast when she is old, or go to temple. It is all because her father did, and she loved him so much. When my grandmother was explaining to me how she found out her father passed away, I almost started crying because I couldn't imagine getting a letter in the mail saying my father had passed away and I wasn't able to say a final goodbye. Even though my mom was very young during all of this, she still remembers a few parts of the story. She remembers riding the train leaving Minsk because it was the first time she had ever ridden the train. She told me, I remember walking on the beach with my grandmother in Italy and being followed by stray dogs. I was scared to death, but my grandma just pushed them away. I thought this was funny because my great-grandmother has always been a very stern, scary, but loving woman. When they got to Columbia, my mom remembers already having cousins living there. They moved into an apartment complex with 6 other Jewish immigrant families. My mom started kindergarten around 6 weeks after being in the U.S. She still remembers her teachers' names to this day, Miss Miles and Miss Motley. She also remembers meeting an older girl, Amy, who was 14 years old when my mom was 7 years old, and she had wanted to be babysat by her, but when she asked my grandmother responded to my mom with, "This is your grandmother. Nice to meet you, Amy, but go home." Even though this isn't much, I think my mom's perspective is very cool because it is through the eyes of a 4-year-old girl. I'm so glad I was able to do this project on my family's story of immigrating here and do it through my grandmother's perspective. She has been through so much, and I am so glad I can get it into a video to be able to remember it forever. My grandmother means so much to me, and she'll always be someone I look up to.